Welcome back. Remember school? Remember that? It's been a while, I know. The reading week stands like this humongous epistemic gap in your mind, like in the before time when we were learning this stuff, you know, before the beautiful moment where you got to intend to catch up and then do nothing. So what we're going to do this week is basically just practice the skills that we introduced before in the before time. There's really not a lot of new material to go over. There's one more rule I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you that right off the bat today. It's not a super crucial rule. So basically you have all of the skills that you're going to need going into the second test, which, let's talk about that now, is 1 week from today. Second test, 1 week from today. That's frightening. There will be 8 symbols. It's a reasonably straightforward in terms of structure test. There will be 8 symbolizations, 4 derivations, all in predicate logic. So this is just the stuff we're covering. Basically everything that we've done since the first test is on the second test. It's going to look almost exactly like the first test, except in predicate logic rather than sentential logic. Nice thing for this test, we got a good room to write in. We're in the exam center, EX200. Everybody's in the exam center, so everybody comes to this room. So it's beautiful. There are desks. There's good lighting. It's much nicer. So that's nice. And it'll be during class time, standard class time, 10 to noon. Any questions about the second test? No truth tables. No truth tables, no short answer. You're just writing symbolizations and derivations. This is absolutely everything that's going to be on the test. Yeah. Yeah?
Are we going to cover invalidity and expansion?
No. No. The invalidities and expansion stuff is kind of like the predicate logic equivalent of truth tables, and we'll do that right at the end. So that'll be on the exam, but not the second test. Okay? So yeah, the exam will include invalidities and expansions and multi-place predicate logic, which we're going to learn or start learning next week after the test. It's just like predicate logic, but with more places. It's easy. That's all I'm going to tell you about it. Okay. Questions about this before we get into it? Yeah.
Are each symbolization and derivation question, are they worth the same as they were on the first test?
That's right. Yeah. So they'll be weighted the same. So 3 per symbolization and 6 per derivation. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. There was a question on Quarkus this morning about whether you get to drop your lowest anything, and the answer is kind of no. Sorry. We're not. Previous iterations of this class had very complex marking schemes where you're like, oh, you can trade off, and if you get a high here, you can. No, we're not going to do any of that, and it's kind of bad at this moment for you. So if you, for example, over reading week forgot that you had an exercise to do, which I saw a number of people did, that's bad for you in this moment, but it's good for you, I propose, comprehensively, because that means I can make the tests and exams slightly easier, right? So if people are losing little bits and pieces off their exercises, or if you get one exercise you did poorly on, that brings the total average of the class down a little, which means that I can make the tests and exams a little easier. I don't have to be really weird and tricky about it to get a reasonable average, reasonable distribution. I can just give you a straightforward test, a straightforward exam. So comprehensively, I assure you, it's better for you that you forgot to do your exercise over reading week. Anyway. Okay. Anything else about this? This week's exercises are up. I don't have a slide about them, but they're up. Same deal as always. They're due on Saturday, 4 p.m. Some symbolization. So I believe it's 6 derivations, 4 symbolizations, and you've already got all the skills to do these, I believe. These are just slightly more difficult versions of the same stuff you did on the last exercises. So there's no new skills that you need to tackle those. You could tackle them right away. Okay? Okay, so let's get into it. Unless there's any other kind of course business questions? No? Good? Okay, good. Okay, so this is the one new thing I'm going to teach you this whole week, I think. Alphabetic variance. And honestly, it's probably not going to come up. It's probably not going to come up. It's a weird little rule. It's not useful in very many contexts. Chances are it's Chances are you will never need to learn this rule, like know this rule to get by. However, I'm going to present it to you because it's helpful partly it's helpful for remembering and understanding scope and no capturing. And it's also just a rule that you have available. People constantly surprise me on these tests, figuring out ways of solving the problem that I wouldn't have thought of. So maybe you'll use this on the test and it'll be useful to you. I can't rule that out. I find it unlikely, but here it is anyway. So here's alphabetic variance. Here's the rule. Given a quantified formula, given an existential or a universal, you can swap out the variable letters. You can just swap them out. AV it, so you have a whole sentence that it's a universal sentence, and you can just say this sentence AV and just change the variable for something else. And that should make sense to you because these variables are supposed to be kind of like stand-ins for whatever, right? The x doesn't mean that there's one. So if you say for all x something, 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 that doesn't mean that there's some specific object x. It's a variable that ranges over, you're saying like for whatever you stick in here. So that means that the letter that you use for the variable name is kind of just, it doesn't matter what that letter is, right? So that's why it's OK to do this. However, you're not allowed to capture. No capturing is allowed, which is a rule that we've seen with UI and EG. And let me just go over that one more time because I think I got a request to do this, and B, I think that there is some general confusion about this. So to remind you of no capturing, and I'll show you why this is a rule in a sec. When you're using UI or you're using UG, you can't UI to a variable that's already bound to a quantifier within the formula. Okay? So you've got a big quantified sentence, and inside it you've got a little quantified sentence, and you want to UI the big one. You can't UI it to something that's bound inside of it. So what does that look like? Here's an example. So here's the first line. There is a big quantified sentence, a big universal, and inside that big universal is a smaller existential. And that smaller, what you're not allowed to do is the following. You're not allowed to say, oh, that first sentence, good, I'm going to universally instantiate that to U. Why not? Because U is the variable that's already inside the little sentence, right? The little sentence inside the big sentence ranges over U. And look what happens when you do that. So the first existential, the existential in the first line says, so the first sentence there says, for all things, let's call them Z, if they've got property D and they've got property E, then there exists something that has property U, and that Z thing has property F. So the thing that you plug in for Z and the thing that you plug in for U can be totally different objects in the first sentence. There's nothing in the first sentence that says that they are either the same or different objects. It makes no claims about that. Whereas in the second sentence, you've made a very clear claim. You're saying the object that has D and the object that has U are the same object. So you come to a conclusion that was not contained in the first line, right? You said, well, I'm going to, by universally instantiating to the thing that was already contained in the sentence, you've given yourself the fact that those are the same object has D and has A, whereas that's not something that was said by the first sentence. Okay? So you've inferred more than you started with, which is the worst thing you can do in a derivation. The rules of a derivation are designed to make sure you don't pull out more than was in those premises to begin with. That's the whole thing about being a truth-preserving inference. And that's what we've violated that rule here. We've come to a conclusion that is stronger than the premises that we started from. Right? We said those are the same object, whereas the first sentence just says there's at least two things in the universe such that there's a Z with these properties and a U with these properties. Maybe they're the same thing, maybe they're not. We don't know. Okay? So that's no capturing. The no capturing is basically just you got a big sentence, quantified sentence with a little quantified sentence inside of it. You're not allowed to EI or UI the big sentence to the thing that's already inside of it, and you're not allowed to EG to something that's already inside of it either, because what it does is opens up the possibility of overstepping what you know already about these objects. Okay? So that's, to remind you, that's no capturing. Okay, so we've seen this no capturing rule with universal instantiation. We've seen it with existential generalization, and now it also applies to alphabetic variance. So you can't do this. When you're doing AV, you're not allowed to do it here either. However, AV can help you get around this problem. So here's an example from the textbook. I'm just going to run through this example. OK. So what we're trying to show is the following. And so the rest of this class is basically just me doing derivations. So sit back and enjoy. So we want to show for all u, if du, then not EU. This is a Brexit-style conclusion. No EU. OK. Oh, God. OK. OK. So here's what I'm going to do this wrong once to show you how it goes wrong, and then I'm going to do it right to show you how to use alphabetic variance to get it right. OK. So here's me doing it wrong. So you want to show a universal. Well, the thing to do then, if you want to show a universal, the thing to do typically is to show an instance of it. So show for some arbitrary instance of u good. OK. Now we're going to assume the antecedent, of course. Assume it for conditional derivation. And try to show not EU. Oh, sorry. You do have to write these show lines, by the way. Show not EU. And we'll assume U for ID. All right. OK. Got our show lines set up. Now we kind of fish around for seeing what we want to do. What do we got here? What do we got? Well, we've got this. We've got DU. We've got EU. We've got these two universal sentences. OK, cool. So EU doesn't actually appear in this one. So I'm going to start with this one for all Z. And here's where I'm going to do it wrong. Here's where I'm going to the tempting thing here, the thing that I want to do is to get this to say EU, right? We've got DU and we've got EU, so we could build DU and EU. Oh, great. OK, so I'm going to universally instantiate premise 1 UI, and DU and EU, then there exists some EU, DU, and FU. No. OK, so that was me capturing. Oh, no, I captured this U. So this premise already said U, right? If I universally instantiate this to U, then I've just made exactly that error that I showed you. You're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to say UI this to U, because that makes this thing U. And that's what we don't know. We don't know that this is the same object, that Z is the same object as U. So we failed in our task. Everything has gone horribly, horribly awry. All right. So that way is not going to work. So here's where alphabetic variance is potentially useful. So forget all that. OK. Let's collect ourselves. Let's try to figure out how to do this properly. The thing to do here is to show the universal for another variable letter, and then use alphabetic variance to get it to match the original show line. So what we're going to do instead of showing, well, I mean, we are going to show for all U this thing. But rather, first, we're going to show for all, let's say, W, DW, then not EW. OK? So we're going to show something. Notice this matches the original show line exactly, but we just switched up the letters. And now the strategy is going to be to show this thing, and then at the end, use alphabetic variance to get it to match the original show line. OK? So let's do that. So we're going to try to show a universal. That means what we want to do is show an instance of it. So show DW, then not EW. OK, cool. Do our assume CD. Show EW and EW, assume for ID. OK. Now I can do the thing that I wanted to do before. So what I wanted to do before was universally instantiate premise 1 to something that I can use. And what I'm going to do is, because I got W's in play here, I'm going to universally instantiate this to W. So that means we got if dw and EW, then there exists some U such that DU and FW. Yeah? UI, sorry. Premise 1, UI. Is that clear how that step went? So I universally instantiated, I replaced all the instances of Z, but nothing else. Even if the Z is within the scope of another quantifier, it's still Z. It's still under the scope of the original Z. OK? OK. And now we can solve this thing. So we've got DW, we've got EW, so we can just put those together. And EW by saying line 4 and line 6, join. And now we've got this antecedent to give us this consequent. So on line 7 and line 8, we can do a modus ponens to give us, there exists some thing such that DU and FW. Great. OK. And anytime you get yourself an existential, the thing to do right away is to existentially instantiate it, right? So we're going to existentially instantiate this to a fresh variable, a variable that we have not seen anywhere in this derivation so far. My go-to is I. So we're going to say DI and FW. Line 9, existential instantiation. Once again, we're EIing to all of the instances of U in this case, but nothing else. We don't EI, we don't turn it into FI. Clear so far? Any questions so far? Yeah.
Can you explain again why continue FC to FW, but everything else is left the same?
FZ to FW? On which line did I do that?
Sorry, I think line 7. You leave the variables like DU as is.
Right.
But everything else is switched.
Right. That's because, so the reason why that's what we do is because when we're universally instantiating premise 1, we universally instantiate every instance of Z to whatever we're UIing to. Right? So we universally instantiate this one and this one and this one. But this U is something, a totally other object, right? We don't say that this U is the same thing as the Z, so we just instantiate every instance, but nothing that's not an instance of that letter. That's why. Is that clear? OK, good. Yeah?
Sorry if I'm mistaken, but didn't you say that FZ may not be the same Z as the DZ and Z?
No, I did not say that. I did not say that. What I said was the U might not be the same object. So what I said is the U and the Z might not be the same thing. They might end up, they're variables. They might end up being the same thing. But there's nothing in that premise that tells us that they're the same thing. Yeah? OK. OK. So we got DI and FW. So now we're going to match things. So the strategy is always, we had an existential, cool, we existentially instantiate it. And then whenever you've existentially instantiated to something, the strategy is probably going to be to universally instantiate things to match it. So you start universally instantiating things that look like they could be useful to match the fresh variable that you just EI'd to. So let's do that with, say, premise 2. We're going to universally instantiate this to I. So if DI, then not FI. OK. So premise 2 UI. And we've got DI here, so line 10, simplify. Line 11, modus ponens, gives us not FI. OK? And now, can we get FI here? How do we close this off? What do we do? Well, quite possibly what we're going to do is universally instantiate this again. So things to look at here, things to consider here are, do I already have a contradiction? Do I already have a contradiction? And if I don't, then start looking around for what else you can UI to match. Yeah?
What if you had
Yeah.
Instead of UI into I,
Yeah.
UI to W.
Okay.
And then you would have, you already have DW from line 4, but then you would have not FW, which you would have a contradiction with in line 10.
Good. Good. Okay. So we'll say premise 2. I'm not even going to erase it. I'm just going to UI again. So UI premise 2 to W. So if DW, then not FW. Right. That was the right move. Thank you. Okay. So now we've got on line 10. We're going to simplify to give us FW. And we've got DW here. So on line 8, simplify DW. I used more lines on this than I needed to, strictly speaking. But so 13, 15, modus ponens gives us not FW. And now we've got our contradiction. So line 16 and line 14, ID. Good. We close off our most recent show line. So we showed not EW, which means that we've got ourselves on line 5 a conditional derivation. Close off this show line. Okay. And now on line 3, that means we did a universal derivation. So we showed for an arbitrary instance of if DW then not EW that it does follow, which means that we've shown this thing. Great. Okay, and now the point of all this was that we're trying to show for all U if DU then EU, and we've shown an exactly matching version of that with just different letters. So now we can say on line 2, AV, and to give ourselves for all U, if DU, then not EU. And 20, direct derivation. Box and cancel. Okay? Okay. So, like, as I said, probably not going to come up all that often. I would be surprised if it came up on the test or exam. I'm not going to design questions such that you have to remember this. If it comes up and if you find it to be handy, that's great. But there you have it. Okay? Questions about AV before we move on? Or any questions about this derivation? Literally all we're going to be doing today is I'm going to stand here and do derivations, and you're going to ask questions or make suggestions when I get lost. That's the plan for the rest of the day. So there's nothing like urgent that we need to get to. Okay, good. Good, so that was the example of using AV to avoid capturing. Okay, so now we're just going to like take a step back and do a bunch more derivations, going over things that I've kind of already said, maybe highlighting a few more strategy tips, that kind of thing. And that's the plan for the rest of the day. So in the before time, I introduced quantifier negation, but didn't really show you it in action. I suspect that you saw it in action in your exercises for last week, but let's do it again to talk about when it's a good idea. So you're trying to get, if the thing that you want to show is an existential, there are two routes to getting your existential. The one way is to show an instance of it and to existentially generalize. And that's going to be very useful in cases where, for example, you've just got it already, right? If you've got Fi and the thing you're trying to show is there exists an Fx, then existential generalization is the way to go. It's super easy, it's fast. If the thing that you're trying to show is big and complicated and you're like, I don't know how I'm going to build an instance of that, probably the strategy is going to be to assume ID, so start an indirect derivation, and then use quantifier negation on it to get a universal statement. So a negated existential gives you a universal statement. And that's typically going to be useful. Very often that's useful for building a contradiction. Notice that these are not mutually exclusive strategies. So if you start off by assuming ID and using quantifier negation, the option of building an instance is always still available to you. So you start an indirect derivation, and you stumble upon a way of building the instance, then you just close it off with a direct derivation and pat yourself on the back. That's fine. So QN is a derived rule. So there will be on the test and exam derived rules and basic rules derivations again. So in the context of doing a basic rules derivation, probably you're going to show an instance. If it's derived rules, pretty much always you're going to want to crack open that, you're going to want to assume ID and crack open that negated existential using quantifier negation. So, said that. Let's do some examples. So many examples today. All right. So, actually, this is from the exercise. I'm going to skip this because it's very much like this one. So here's a theorem. Here's a weird theorem. If you read this out, it's especially weird. So if it's the case that all objects have property f, then that means there exists some object that has property f, which is strange because there's nothing that logically says that anything exists, right? There's no rule of logic that says that anything has to exist. So it's a little philosophically odd. This is incompatible with the logical possibility of a completely empty universe, but that's, anyway. Maybe it's just people like me that find that odd, but anyway. So let's do the derivation, and I'll prove to you that this is true, and then we can boggle together about it. It's a fairly straightforward derivation. So show for all x, fx, then there exists an x such that fx. OK. And all of our old sentential rules still apply. The way that we figure out how to approach a strategy or to approach a derivation is still, if it's a conditional, you start yourself a conditional derivation. So we'll assume for all x, fx, we'll assume that for conditional derivation, and try to show there exists an x such that fx. And in this case, we're doing a derived rules one. So we're going to take there does not exist an x such that fx and assume it for ID. OK? And then we can do quantifier negation on that. Oh, wait. I solved this the other way. Sorry, I solved this originally without doing that. So let me show you existential generalization for this one, and then we'll do quantifier negation. Sorry, this was my one. I picked this one specifically because you can solve it without using quantifier negation, and I forgot that. So let's do this without quantifier negation, and then try to do quantifier negation on some more complicated cases. My apologies. OK, so what have we got here to work with? Well, we have exactly one available line and no premises. So probably we're going to do something with that available line. Yeah? OK, so we're going to, and it's a universal, so we're going to universally instantiate it to something. What do we universally instantiate it to? Well, there's literally only one thing in play right now. X is the only variable that's going on, so X is the only one. You could UI it to whatever you want, but right now, X seems like the only game in town, right? Fx from line 2. UI. OK? And now it's pretty easy. We want this existential. Fine. So what do? We existentially generalize. So we say line 4, e.g., there exists an x such that fx. And hey, look at that. That's the thing we're trying to show. So line 5, we did a direct derivation. Hooray! And then on line 3, we did our conditional derivation. Hooray. OK. So that was doing this with existential generalization. We recall existential generalization, right? And why it makes sense. So if I know fx is true, then I know at least one object has the property f, right? Yeah? OK. OK, questions about that? About building an existential using EG? OK, now let's see the other version of this. Let's see the quantifier negation version of this. So we'll do some, these are some longer, funkier derivations that we're going to get into now. OK. Honestly, it's hard to find examples of big, long, difficult derivations where EG is the right way to use, the right way to build an existential. So this is what we're going to do now. OK. This is going to be long and annoying, just so you know. Show if there exists an x such that jx, then there exists an x such that gx and jx. OK. And as always, we're going to assume this for conditional derivation and try to show the consequent. Good. OK. Oh, yeah. And since we're trying to show an existential, here we're going to assume ID. And use. So this is basically, in any derived rules derivation, this is basically going to be an automatic move to do the quantifier negation, gx and jx. So that's line 4, quantifier negation. Did I do that right? Here's the question. I did. Oh, thank God. All right. So to remember quantifier negation, really, I showed you 8 versions of quantifier negation. Probably the only 2 that you need to remember are when you start with a negated existential or you start with a negated universal. If you have an existential, you typically want to just existentially instantiate it. If you have a universal, typically you want to universally instantiate it. Those are useful sentences to you, right? If you have an unnegated universal or existential, those are useful just as they are. So you can use those to do things. A negated existential or a negated universal are kind of useless except for A, building contradictions, or B, using quantifier negation. So really the only 2 versions you need to remember, probably, well, the ones that are most urgent to remember, let me put it that way, are the ones where you start with a negated existential or a negated universal. And I remember them just in terms of like, you change the existential universal or universal to existential and move the negation inside. Yeah? So the negation was outside the existential, now it's inside. We're not saying this is not a negated universal sentence, this is for all y. It's not the case that this thing. Yeah? OK. OK, so now what do we do? The first thing to do is to check to see if you've got any existentials that you need to instantiate. Those are the kind of urgent. So 2 things are fighting for urgency in your mind here. Do I need to start a universal derivation, which needs a fresh variable? Or do we need to existentially instantiate to anything, which also needs a fresh variable? So those are things you want to do right off after you've done your really, really like automatic show lines setup. Those are the first steps. Yeah? I just didn't draw the x properly. It's all, there's only x's in this whole thing, so they should all be x's. Those should all be x's. Thank you. OK. OK, now that we've got that cleared up, So the thing to do right off the bat, so I mean, you might be tempted at line 5 to start universally instantiating that thing. So line 5, it's universal. You could universally instantiate it. But just hang on a second, because you don't yet know what you want to universally instantiate to. X is fine, but probably there's going to be something better, more useful, after you've done, for example, existentially instantiating line 2. Line 2 is an existential that we can do something with if we instantiate it. So I'm going to instantiate it to I, EI. OK. And now we've got a whole new variable in play. We've got something that the I is something that we probably are going to want to match. We're going to want to match things to that I. So we can, for example, universally instantiate line 5 to I now. So it's not the case that GI and JI. And if we're doing derived rules, then we can get ourselves or JI via line 7 De Morgan's. OK. OK, fairly straightforward so far. We're just kind of making the really obvious moves. We haven't even really started thinking about what our goals are here. So do you remember way back when I told you about the forward thinking and backwards thinking strategies for doing a derivation? So far, we've just been doing the forward thinking strategy. I've just been sort of looking at what is required of me by the standard opening moves here. This might be a good time to sit back a little, reflect on where we're trying to get. So switch perspectives for a minute and look at this backwards looking strategy. So you know, we're in an assume ID, so that means there's probably a good chance we're going to try to build a contradiction with something. You know, what have we got here? Where are we trying to get? How do we access useful resources? We could universally instantiate this. I mean, wouldn't hurt. It never hurts to universally instantiate things. It never like makes things worse for you. But we don't have an F and we don't have an H anywhere in our available lines, right? There's no Fs or H's that would be useful to us. So having if Fi then not Hi doesn't really get us anywhere, right? That's not going to be a useful thing to have. There's only one other premise here, and that's this big disjunction. Premise 1 is this big disjunction. And we would like to have one of the other halves of it, right? It would be nice if we had if we had the negation of one half of it, you get the other half, and that's potentially useful. OK, so let's try to do that. Unless anybody can see, that's how I'm going to proceed. Is there anybody got another suggestion for how to proceed here? OK. So let's try that. Let's try to show the negation of one half of this. So basically, we were stuck. We were like, OK, I don't really know what to do now. And what do you do when you're stuck? When you're utterly stuck, you don't have any resources available, you write yourself a show line. Try to show something useful. Set yourself a goal and attempt to show it. So I'm going to attempt to show the negation of this thing. And that would get me this thing. So write myself a brand fresh show line. It's not the case that for all x, jx, then gx. OK. And again, there should be, for a show line, there should be nothing in this right-hand column. Tons of people on the test wrote logic 2010 commands in here. Those are not rules in our system. This should just be blank, just to remind you. OK? You just write whatever show. I just wrote this show line because that's the show line I wanted. I don't need to justify my goals to you. I just have goals. OK? Yeah. Again, implicit life lessons in derivations. Yeah?
Can't you EI premise 1?
You cannot EI premise 1.
Why?
Because premise 1 is not an existential. It's a disjunction.
Oh, I didn't see it. Oh.
OK, good. Good. Yeah, you can only apply these rules to whole sentences, and then that's consistent across all the rules we've dealt with. It's got to be the whole sentence. So you can't EI. That's what we want to do. That's where I want to get. And if I'm successful in showing not for all x if jx and gx, then I'll get that existential, and then I can EI it to something. So that's where we're trying to go. Okay. And one of the reasons why I picked this one, so why did I try to show this half rather than the other half? Well, one reason is when I assume ID, I get this nice universal statement that I can do lots of stuff with. That's nice. So for example, I can UI this to, let's say, I. So line 10, UI. If JI, then GI. OK, cool. Well, I've got JI on line 6. So line 6 and 11, modus ponens, giving me GI. And look at this. I've got not GI or not JI. I've got GI. So on line 12, I got to double negate it, but I can still use that with line 8, modus tollendo ponens, giving me not JI. And yeah?
Didn't you also just like line 6 double negation and then 8 modus tollendo ponens and then get negative GI?
Yes, I could have. Yes, I could have. That's right. Yeah, so you could go either way with this. Right. So line 6, I got to repeat this. 13, ID, close off that subderivation. OK. And another thing, just to remind you, once I've boxed and canceled, so once I've crossed off this show line and drawn these boxes, these lines are no longer available. I can no longer cite them even using the repeat rule. These are inaccessible to me. However, this line is accessible to me now. I've crossed out the show line to say it's no longer a goal. This is a thing I have accomplished. Bully for me, I have accomplished it. OK. So why did I try to accomplish this again? Oh, yeah. I was trying to get the negation of 1/2 of this. So now I can say on line 9, premise 1, MTP, giving me this lovely existential. Hooray. X and HX. OK. So now I should EI to something. And you're tempted, because I would be really useful, to EI to I. You cannot do that. You are not allowed to EI to I because it's not fresh. It's not a fresh variable. You have to EI to a fresh variable every time. Just because it was fresh at the beginning of it's all used up now. OK, so EI to something fresh. So line 15, we're going to EI to J this time. So FJ and HJ. OK. OK, so we've cracked open premise 1. We've gotten the juicy innards of it. We've used this existential to EI to some fresh variable. And now the strategy is going to be just the same as it was before. We're going to UI to match that new fresh variable. So we've got all these universal statements that are still useful to us. You can UI to as many different things as you want. So once you've EI'd to a fresh variable, you say, well, J is no use to me because I don't have it anywhere the previous lines. But you've got those universals still, which you can then UI to match J. So Fj and Hj, well, we've got, here's a good one. For all x, if fx, then not hx. That's probably going to be useful. So let's UI that. So premise 2, we're going to UI to j. And that gives us if fj, then not hj. And I hope you can now see how to finish this derivation. Yeah?
Would I have been the same if you get AV after line
AV,
15?
well, what would that get us? So we're going to AV line 15?
Yeah.
What would that get us?
Like if you AV it to J.
Well, that would be there exists some j such that fj and hj. It's still an existential at that point. So you can't use it for these sentential. So I'm going to close this derivation off using our old sentential skills. You still can't do that with the existential. If there exists, you could. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But then you'd have to EI it to some even other. You'd have to EI it to k or something in order to get at the juicy innards of the existential statement. Yeah? It's probably the grossest way of describing derivations. But, OK. Yeah, so alphabetic variance would get you a different existential statement. It wouldn't get you these free variables, which are what we're going to use to close this thing off. OK, so, and yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward. Hopefully from here, we're just going to say line 16, simplify, 17, modus ponens, giving us not hj. And on line 19, we've got hj here and not hj there. So 16, simplify, 18, id. And now we've shown this thing. On line 20, we've showed, on line 3, we did a conditional derivation. And we're done. Hooray. Yeah? Yeah.
On tests, when you're showing the indirect derivation, do you want us to show like both variables separately? Like, should we have a separate line that just says like hj instead of doing it within a different step?
How I did it there should be OK. Did anybody lose marks on the test for doing it this way? If you did, that's bad, and we should fix that. This should be, I think this should be OK. So long as line 16 and 18 are within the subderivation that you're working on, you don't need to, and if they're outside, you can use repeat, assuming it's not closed off. This should be fine. I think line 19 there should be a reasonable way of doing this. If you're feeling careful and pedantic, then feel free to write out. So I'm compressing these. I'm told at least one TA said a few of you were putting too many things on one line. That's more of an aesthetic preference to help them read and understand. But like, hopefully what I've done here is a good exemplar and should be perfectly acceptable. Yeah. Any other questions about this derivation? OK, good. Let's take a break. Let's come back at 11:10, and we'll do some more examples. OK, so we're just going to continue on doing examples and examples and examples. So the thing I want you to pick out of this example is just the idea that you often are going to have to do, you're going to UI the same thing to different variables to get what you want. So that's the point of this. I think I've talked about this, but here's a weird little derivation that you can, there was actually a request by one of our most prolific commenters on the Quarkus for understanding of this, and I propose to do it right now. Where'd it go? Oh no, where'd it go? No. I forgot to write this down. Oh no, there it is, there it is. OK. So here's a weird one. So we're going to try to show for all y if fx, OK, now it's important that I distinguish my y's and my x's, fx and gy. OK. So, and all we've got to work with is fx and gx. Weird, right? It's weird. So with a universal derivation, the standard way of approaching it, the standard way of opening up my show line is a universal. So the thing to do is to try to show an arbitrary instance of this. So, and you do that right away. So try to show fx and gy. OK. Now what? Now what? Because I don't have gy. I don't have anything with y in it. The hell, man? How do I get y? Miracle, yes. A miracle occurs, and no, that's not. Let's try to do this. Let's do this the real way. OK, so I got no y's. I have no y's in this derivation. How do I get a y? Probably by universally instantiating to it. Probably. Let's try it. the thing to do here is actually to say, I want to show for all x if or fx and gx. So I'm going to show this thing and then universally instantiate it to what I need. That's the strategy here. It's a weird one, but so, and again, we're going to show an arbitrary instance, fx and gx. Oh, that should be line 4, not line 3. Well, showing an arbitrary instance of fx and gx is pretty straightforward, right? Because we've got that as our premise. fx and gx, cool, premise 1. So did that, line 5, direct derivation, no sweat. Okay, and then on line 4, I did a universal derivation, easy. Yeah?
Why would you do step 5 if you already have the premise? Why would you made a direct derivation? Can't you just say premise 1 and get the same result?
Yes, I could. Yes, I could. You are correct. I could save one line here. Yeah. Partly I want to be explicit as possible to have not a 0-line derivation might be confusing to some. It's pedagogical reasons, really. Okay. Question? Yeah.
Are we saying the premise 1 is equivalent to for all x, fx, and gx?
We're not saying it's equivalent, but we're saying that you can derive one from the other.
So the premise 1 is stronger than for all x, fx, and gx.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sounds weird, right? It sounds weird to say fx and gx is stronger than for all x, fx and gx. Partly what explains that weirdness is the weirdness of free variables. So fx and gx are free variables here. There's no English equivalent. I'm not saying there is an object with f and there is an object with x. There's no way to say in English what fx and gx actually says, which is, again, why you never want to end up with unbound variables in your symbolizations. So there's no English equivalent of the first sentence. So it's just very bizarre. OK. Anyway, so now we've got line 3. We've got line 3. We've got for all x, fx, and gx. And now we can universally instantiate it to the things that we want. So for example, we can say fx and gx. Well, we got that already. So we don't really need to say fx and gx. We can, however, universally instantiate, well, I'll do it anyway. Get my fx and gx back out of there. Another pointless line, but that's fine. However, we can, the real trick here is we want to say fx and gy, line 3, ui. Those are definitely supposed to be y's. And now look what we've got. Yeah?
Right, do you mind just explaining one more time why you wrote the show line on line 3? Like why it is that you're showing universal?
So I tried to show this universal so that I could do line 9. Right? The mystery of this question is, where the heck do I get gy from? There's no y. You didn't start with any y's. How am I supposed to get gy? Well, one of the ways of getting something like gy is to have a universal statement that you can universally instantiate. So that's what we're hoping to get out of writing that show line. Line 9 is what I was hoping to get out of writing that show line. Yeah? And now, because the point of this is to show this weird for all y, fx, and gy, I have gx. I had gx from premise 1. So you could say premise 1 simplify. I've had gx all along. Sorry, gx is not what I wanted. Fx is what I wanted. So I've had fx all along. What I wanted was gy, and I've got that here. So line 9, because I built this universal, I can now universally instantiate it to something that will give me gy. So I can say line 9 simplify to give me gy, and just put those together. Fx and gy, 10, 11, adjoint. Hooray! Because that's the thing I was trying to show all along. So on line 12, I did a direct derivation. Cancel and box, which means that on line 2, I did a universal derivation. Cancel and box. Yeah? Okay, an odd little question, an odd little question. Yeah?
On line 8, what's the thing beside the X and an I?
It's got to be an X. It's got to be an X. The only thing I'm allowed to UI to there is an X.
Okay.
My apologies for being unclear, but because I'm UIing a universal, I have to replace these X's with the same thing. All of them have to get the same thing. I could have UI'd to I, but this is more clearly an X. Yeah. I will attempt to write more clearly. But okay with that? Yeah.
How can we apply the universal derivation because the line 2 is fx, it's not fy?
Well, it appeared in a show line, not an available line.
So in this case, we treat x as a constant maybe.
No?
We don't care about fx in line 2. We can say because line 2 we show like for all y, then fx and gy.
Sorry?
Yeah, how do we treat the fx in line 2?
The fx in line 2, because it's not an available line, because it's a show line, you can't, an available line is a line that you can use in your derivation, right? If it's an available line, you can cite it and say, okay, I'm going to do something with this. However, line 2 is not available. When I start this universal derivation here, so from line 4, line 2 is not an available line. So if you remember the rules for what you're allowed to do this on, it's not the case, you're not allowed to use it if it's appeared free in an available line or a premise cited in an available line. So if on line 2 I had said cited premise 1, then it wouldn't be allowed. If this makes you nervous, then the thing to do would actually be to show for all z. So instead of saying all x, show all z. Just do an arbitrary, totally fresh variable, and then I still would have been able to make all the same moves down here. Oh, would I? Yeah. Anyway, did I answer your question? Sort of. It doesn't appear, the thing is, it does not appear free in an available line. That's why we're allowed to start a universal derivation with it. Any other questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
By using the same variable, does that mean that we're talking about the same thing, or not necessarily?
So it depends on whether the variable is free or bound. So if it's bound, then it's not necessarily the same thing. Yeah? If it's bound, then you can say for all x, fx, and then for all x, gx. Those x's don't necessarily talk about the same thing. Once it's free, so once we've got a sentence like fx and gx, then it's kind of pinned to one thing. This was my annoyance with the language here. A free variable is not that free, and a bound variable is very free. So the alpha, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to show you alphabetic variance is because if you got a quantified sentence, you can just swap out the variable, right? So you can say instead of for all x, fx, you can say for all y, fy. And so there's nothing sort of like tying that variable to any specific object. But once it appears free, then you're saying, there's some thing, we'll call it y, and it's the same thing anytime it appears free. So all the free instances are referring to the same thing. We don't know what it is, but we're just saying we'll call it y. That's it. So good. You're welcome. OK, let's do another. Right. So the point of this next example is to show you that sometimes, so always, 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 you're going to EI first, quickly, off the bat, and then UI to match that. Sometimes you have to go back and forth a little bit, though. You might have to UI, and then EI, and then UI again. So let's do some back and forth style stuff. So 2.229, 3.229, all right. There we go. So it's a theorem. Show that there exists some x such that if there exists an x fx, then fx. OK. So we're going to try to show an existential here. Remember that you've got two routes to an existential. You can show an instance, or you can assume ID and do quantifier negation. In this case, because it's a theorem, we have no premises to work with. We have no other parts of this. Like we're not halfway through a derivation where you got a lot of available lines or anything. Probably the showing an instance strategy is not going to work out for us. So in this case, and really kind of typically, you might want to start off with, not might, you do want to start off with this assume ID thing. So, yeah? And then pretty much always you're going to want to do quantifier negation. It's not the case that there exists an x fx, then fx. Okay, line 2, quantifier negation. OK. We did quantifier negation because line 2 is kind of useless to us. You could somehow build a contradiction. If you had more stuff to work with, if you had premises or other available lines, then you could build a contradiction here. I don't see any way of building a contradiction with that except by using quantifier negation. Now, line 3, we turned a useless line into a very useful line because we can existentially instantiate this thing. So let's do that right away. Line 3, we're going to, sorry, not existentially instantiate, universally instantiate. And again, in this case, universally instantiate it to something useful. What's the only possible useful thing here? X. So we're going to universally instantiate this thing to x. So we say it's not. There exists an x such that fx, then fx. OK. Good. So we want to do something with this. Negation of conditional. Yeah? So remind me how that goes. That moves the negation where? To the second one. Thank you. So line 4, negation of conditional. Once again, highlighting the danger of practicing on Logic 2010, because Logic 2010 solves for me how to do negation of conditional, and then I just blanked on it. So, yeah.
Should I find beyond Joel? It's no more conditional.
Oh, of course, of course. Once again, highlighting the importance of practicing by hand. All of my mistakes are lessons. That's the, yeah. OK. Now we've got something going on. Now we've got the possibility of doing something with these lines, right? So the strategy is almost always to try to get yourself into a position where you can use your old sentential logic skills. Pretty much you want to strip away the quantifiers, you want to strip away the negations until you can do something with the skills that we learned in the first part of this course. And now we're at that point. We can say, we can pull this apart into EX, FX, line 5, simplify. Good, and we've got not FX, line 5, simplify. OK. And then the thing to do with an existential, line 6, we've got an existential. The thing to do is always to instantiate it as soon as you have the opportunity. So FI, line 6, existentially instantiate. OK, great. Now we've got FI. What of it? How can we turn fi into something useful? So the first thing we did in this was to ui to x, because we had no other options. Now we've ei'd to something fresh. Now what?
Probably want to do UI step again, except again lines.
Exactly, exactly. So we want to make, we UI'd to get access to the existential, and then we EI'd the existential, and now we're going to UI again to match the thing that we got from the existential. So we're going to say, this is the only universal we've got, so on line 3, we're going to universally instantiate, and we just go through, write it out exactly, replacing all of the instances of x with I. Good. Once again, we're going to do negation of conditional. I've got it in front of me this time, so I'm less likely to screw it up. And not fi. And now we're pretty much done, because we've got fi and we've got not fi. So line 10, simplify to give us not fi. And then on line 8 and 11, we've got our indirect derivation. Box and cancel. Yeah? Yeah.
So when you did UI to line 3,
Yeah.
how come it's not it's the existential, you change the
Oh, I screwed it up. I totally screwed it up. I screwed it up. That's why. Because the x, so this is a scope, I made a scope error. Thank you for pointing that out. The scope within this line, so I'll write it out. So for all x, okay. So the scope of this x is really just, it really just applies to this. The scope of this x applies to this. Fortunately, it did not screw up our, so if you go like this, it did not screw up our derivation. So it wasn't a crucial mistake, but it was a mistake. It was a mistake to instantiate that to I. Yeah. Apologies for that. Yeah.
So the rule is that the variable falls outside the scope if it's captured by another quantifier.
That's right. That's right. So, and this is again where the arbitrariness of a bound variable is relevant. So this sentence says, for all x, it's not the case that there exists something, and it's not necessarily the same thing as this x, because the scope of this quantifier is bound to the existential. Yeah? So if we'd done alphabetic variance on this line, for example, changed it to y, you'd get for all y, you'd have to leave these as x. Does that make sense? Because this x is not under the scope of this quantifier. It's bound to the smallest quantified sentence that it's connected to. I'm seeing looks of displeasure and incredulity. I understand. I'll make fewer of these mistakes in the winter semester. Sorry. Yeah.
Is it possible to UI line 7 to make it not fi and then just do like indirect derivation there?
Sorry, UI line 7?
Yeah, is that possible?
No, because it's not a universal.
Oh,
Yeah, it's a free variable. You can't UI something that's just a free variable. Yeah. Sorry, there's another hand? Yeah.
yeah. So in line 4, is it okay that we still UI to the variable x?
Yeah.
Or is that capturing?
No, that's okay. That's okay. Because you haven't, so if you were changing this, then it would be a problem. But yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
So we need to show an instance after an existential variable. Does that mean like doing the same thing as we would if we had a universal, just showing it inside the brackets and then closing it off with the key? Because I thought we could only do that with
sorry, could you?
Oh,
Sorry.
So when you mean show an instance after an existential quantifier, if I were to do that, would I just show what's inside the brackets?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And then to close that off, I would just do EG.
Well, you can. EG is nice because you can go from. So there's a question about how to deal with EG. So EG is nice if I had, for example, this is what I want. I mean, if you have fx, then you can EG that to there exists an x such as fx. It's also true that if you had fi, you could use that to get your ex fx. So just any instance that exactly matches it except for the variable, then you can EG to it. Okay? Okay. Another? Oh, let's do another. We're having so much fun. Oh. What else did I want? Oh yeah, the blind UI. This is a fun one. Okay. So. Oh wait, which one was the blind UI? 3.036. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Okay. So this is an example of what to do. Premise 1 here is a little bit odd because what you've got is an existential buried inside a universal. And you can't access that existential until you've dealt with the universal, right? If it's, you can't, so for example, you're not allowed to take premise 1 and EI it. You can't existentially instantiate that because the universal is out front, right? So in order to get at this existential, you have to first universally instantiate it. And this is one of those cases where you're universally instantiating this thing to kind of just whatever you can, so that you can access the EI, or the existential. Anyway, let's do this. So there exists an x such that it's not the case that if fx, then not gx. Okay. Again, showing an existential, probably the strategy is going to be to assume ID, not fx, then not gx. And use quantifier negation on it. So for all x, move this inside. Either of these would be fine, not fx, then not gx, to qn. I'll say if you just did on this 0 negations, so that's fine. Similarly, this is fine. Okay? Okay. Right. So far we've set up our show line. We've assumed for indirect derivation, and then we've gotten at the juicy innards of that negated existential by using quantifier negation. And now we can do something with that universal. So we could universally instantiate it to x. That would be fine. But first, what I'd like to do is try to get at the innards of premise 1. So I want to get at, should I stop using just biological metaphors? Okay, yes, okay. So I would like to have access to the contents of the existential in premise 1. So the way to do that is to first universally instantiate it. So we're going to universally instantiate it just to x. So there exists a y such that fy then not gx. Okay. So premise 1, ui. Okay. So now universally instantiating it to x. I'm not allowed to universally instantiate it to y because that would be capturing, right? Because inside this, so kind of imagine brackets here. There's a little existential inside the big universal. So if I tried to UI this to y, that would be capturing. That would be saying there exists a y that this thing is true of. So no capturing rule says I'm not allowed to UI to y there. However, I am allowed to UI to x. That's OK. And now I've got this existential that I can do something with. What do we do with that existential? We instantiate it. So line 4, existential instantiation. That gives us, it's not the case that if fi, then not gx. Make sure to only instantiate those variables that are the same as the quantifier, right? So we don't say not gi. We say not the case that if fi, then not gx. Yeah? OK. So once again, we've got the negation of a conditional. So get at the insides of this, fi and not gx. Good. OK, so now we've got fi. That's nice. Gx, also nice. Now what? Yeah?
You could UI line 3 to either I or X.
Let's try it. Let's try it. Let's do both, just for the sake of, line 3 UI. So now we've got, we'll do x first. If fx, then not gx. And same thing. If fi, then not gi. Why not? OK. And see if we can do anything with either of those lines. Things are going well. You can tell things are going well because I've got moves to make with old sentential skills. So for example, I've got fi, and I've got if fi, then not gi. So that's cool. So I can do line 6, simplify, line 8, notice ponens, get myself not gi. OK. I've also got not gx, which will give me, using line 6, simplify, line 7, modus tollens, will give me not fx. OK, neat. So now I've got some stuff to work with. Now what?
Can I simplify 6 and double negate? No, never mind.
OK. Here's the trick. We're going to EI line 5 or line 4 again. Are we? Actually, we're going to UI premise 1 again, this time to I. So oh. OK. And then we can existentially instantiate this, always to a new variable, a fresh variable. But if fj, then not gi. Do our negation of conditional again, fj and not gi. Line 12 and C. And now the solution is fairly straightforward. We've got not gi, we've got not gi. So line 13, simplify, line 9, ID. And that was it. OK, so the tricky bit was UIing again to match. And the reason why this was tricky is because I've been giving you the impression, the way that we've been doing derivations is once you've used an existential, once you've instantiated an existential, it's kind of used up, right? You can EI to a variable once, and then you can't EI to that variable ever again, right? Because it's not a fresh variable anymore. But on line 12 there, I EI'd to a totally fresh variable, which usually wouldn't get me anywhere, except that part of this is the not gi, which I universally instantiated to something new. So on premise 1, I stripped away the universal, I universally instantiated it to something that would be useful to me, and I got at it by EIing again to something that's irrelevant. So at no point, I'm not going to use this fj. That's useless to me. But I was able to strip away this existential by instantiating to j, and then getting at the not gi that I wanted. So the point of this is just the back and forth between UIing and EIing. Yeah? Sometimes you're going to have to bounce back and forth between the two. And it'll often be the case that you don't know what the right thing to UI to is going to be. You don't know what you need to UI to until after you've done some existential instantiation, maybe done some sentential logic moves. And then, oh, you know what would be nice here is not gi. Well, I can get that by re-UIing and then stripping away the existential with an instantiation because this is a slightly weird, I mean, it's the weird property of this x being bound to one quantifier. This x is bound to the universal, and this y is bound to the existential, which makes this potentially useful to UI, then EI, then UI again, then EI again. Yeah? OK. Questions about this? Why are you doing this? What's going on? Yeah?
How did you read premise 1 in like plain?
That's a good question. So let me try. Let me attempt a reading. For all objects x, there exists some object y such that it's not the case that if y has property f, then x does not have property g. No? OK. So on Wednesday, we'll do another round of symbolization work. So we'll talk more about how to read this stuff out loud. Again, not learning any new skills. I'm not going to introduce any new rules or techniques or anything. We're just going to do a bunch more practice. That's the plan. OK. Well, I got one more derivation we could do, if you're feeling up to it, or we could just call it a day. One more. I won't be offended if you just wander out. That's fine. OK. Oh, good, and it's a big, ugly one. Great. All right, settle down. You asked for this. All right. We'll do it fairly quickly. Sorry. Gx and fx. Great. OK, so we'll do this derived rules. I'm just going to assume that we have quantifier negation. So I'll do my assume ID, fx, assume ID, and then our quantifier negation for all x. It's not the case that gx and fx. Great. Line 2, qn. All right. First step, check out see if you've got any existentials you want to instantiate. Oh boy, I do. Look, premise 1, 2, 3, 4 is an existential. So we're going to say fi, premise 4, existentially instantiate. And then we're probably going to match things to I. Great. So what do we got here? We've got a bunch of universals. We got 3 as a universal. This is a universal. This is a universal. And we've also got another situation here where we've got this disjunction where it would be useful to have one of the other sides of it. So I'm going to go ahead and try to show the negation of 1/2 of this, just on the intuition that this is the kind of derivation that Logic 2010 throws at me that I have to do something. I'm going to have to do something with this premise 1, right? So I could do, I mean, at this point, it's open to me. I could just instantiate these to I. I guess it wouldn't hurt. So not the case that GI and FI, line 3 UI, KI. It's entirely possible that I'm just wasting my time right now. Oh, that should be an I. Premise 2, UI. But, you know, if you find it cognitively helpful, then these are good moves to make. Premise, what's 2, premise 3 UI. OK. OK. Now the thing to do is to try to show the negation of 1/2 of these. So I don't see anything really great I can do with this. Well, I guess I can do 4 and 7. I can do this modus ponens. That's fine. OK. But again, I might be wasting my time. I might be doing moves that are unnecessary, because if I show the negation, for example, of this, show it's not the case that for all x, fx, then gx, what I'm going to get is this existential. And then I'm going to have to instantiate that existential to something fresh, right? So is it clear why I wrote this show line? Because it showed the negation of this to get at this. I'll just, should I UI it to I or X? I'll do I. I got a lot of stuff in I right now, so if FI, then GI. I got FI, that's cool. So I get myself GI by doing line 4, 11 modus ponens. OK. What else we got? We got this thing. Could be useful. So line 5 De Morgan's, giving us not GI or not FI. Oh, I feel a contradiction coming on. Can you feel it? I feel a contradiction. So line 12, double negate, 13 MTP gives us not FI. Ooh, we did it. We did it. Line 4, repeat. Line 14 are our contradiction. Hooray. See, not FI and FI. Got ourselves a contradiction, which means we've shown this thing. Yay. OK, yeah?
What was the point of premise 2 in the whole?
What was the point of premise 2?
We didn't use
Well, we haven't used it yet.
Oh,
We haven't used it yet, but we've just unlocked something that might make it useful. So we've just given ourselves, wow, I typed this out wrong. That should be a backwards E. But you all got it. You got it. You get it. Okay. I love how when you make a mistake, I'm like, no, logic is rigorous. And when I do it, I'm like, ah. Okay. 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 Line 9, premise 1, MTP. Okay. I don't have to pass this course. Okay. Okay. So, we've got this existential. Great. Now we can existentially instantiate it to something. Got to be something fresh. Fj and Hj. And now I'm kind of regretting having done all this stuff in I, because probably it's not going to be all that helpful. But nonetheless, we did it. So it's not going to hurt either. So now we got Fj and Hj. Now what do we do? Now what do we do? Well, I kind of cast around and see. Standard operating procedure. Once you've got something new, you look back over your resources and ask yourself where it might be helpful. So Fj and Hj, for example. So the places we might use this are line 3. We can still instantiate this. We can instantiate premise 2 and premise 3. So let's try premise 3. Universally instantiate that to j. So if you got Fj, then you get Kj and Jj. Hey, JJ. Line 17, we can simplify and use that on line 18 to do modus ponens, giving us Kj and Jj. Hey, JJ. Okay. Okay. So that looks useful, doesn't it? Maybe useful here. So let's do premise. Now we're using premise 2. But it turns out we universally instantiated it to something useless last time. But this time I have a real good feeling. This time I think we can get something good. So not Jx or not Hx. Okay, I'm gonna do a real cramped start over here. Okay. And we got Kj, and we got this modus ponens thing here. We got a conditional, so let's do that. So we're going to get not. Those should be J's. These should all be J's. So we're going to get not Jj or not Hj by doing 19, simplify, 20 modus ponens. I have gone off the edge of the world. Excuse me. Okay. And that should be line 21. Okay. So now we've got not Jj or not Hj. We've got Jj over here. So line 19, simplify again. Oops. Line 20, and we'll double negate that so that we can use it with line 21 and an MTP to give us not Hj. So I haven't really even been thinking very hard about these moves, to be honest. All I did was like, hey, I got some new stuff in J. What can I do with it? So I started UIing to match, and then I've just been making these like simple, dumb sentential logic moves and hoping some kind of contradiction falls out. That's basically how I'm dealing with this right now. And look, it worked out. My bumbling approach to life has once again paid off for me as a white male. It's amazing. Okay. So on line 17, we simplify and get Hj. And now we've got not Hj and Hj. So 22, 23, indirect derivation. Box all the way up to the top, and we're done. Okay. I hope some of that was instructive, including the mistakes. We're gonna do symbolization practice on Wednesday. Thanks, everyone.